In front of 17 million viewers, Vice President J.D. Vance insulted Jasmine Crockett with a smirk and 6 words that shattered every boundary of dignity. She didn't flinch. 48 hours later, she filed a $100 million lawsuit that rocked the foundation of political power. One man tried to humiliate her on national television. One woman turned that humiliation into history. Will his insult cost him everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The House chamber was full, but dead quiet. This wasn't just another hearing, it was a showdown. The banner read, Federal Budget Review, Medicaid line item. But what everyone knew was this: $22 billion were on the chopping block, and the first ones to bleed would be poor kids. At the center table sat J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States, arms folded like he already knew the outcome. No smile, no hesitation, just a low, cold voice through the microphone. The federal budget is not a place for sad stories or emotional detours. For 3 full seconds, no one breathed. Then Jasmine Crockett stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look at Vance at first. Her eyes scanned the room like a surgeon before the first cut. We're not talking about stories. We're talking about children. But Vance leaned forward, smirking, and cut her off. What you're pushing is not policy. It's the financial circus of the emotional left. A wave of gas hit the room. One Republican chair whispered, "He went there." Crockett's fingers curled around her binder, but she didn't blink. Democrats sat forward. Republicans leaned back. The line had been drawn, sharp and deep. For the first time, Jasmine looked him dead in the eye. "You call it a circus. I call it survival." Vance didn't move. "Then you're not fit to talk budget? Emotions make bad math." Silence, then murmurs. Then the kind of tension that makes a room feel like it might explode. That was it. The opening shot had been fired. One side clung to cold efficiency. The other refused to let humanity be collateral damage, and neither side planned to back down. And just like that, the room shifted from cold policy debate to something raw, human, and about to boil over. Jasmine Crockett didn't sit down. She stood motionless for a beat, then slowly opened the red folder on the desk in front of her, her fingers steady, deliberate. The pages inside were marked, highlighted, tabbed in yellow. She had come prepared for a debate, but now this was war. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped, calm and clear like someone delivering the results of an autopsy. According to this report, if this budget cut passes, 12.3 million children will lose their health insurance. The words were unshaken, but behind them was a fury that didn't need to shout. 12 million kids. Each syllable struck like a nail into the wood of public conscience. She didn't plead. She didn't appeal to morality. She weaponized reality. Members of the chamber leaned forward unconsciously, drawn to the weight of that number. A number too big to ignore, but now impossible to deny. J.D. Vance reclined in his chair, unfazed. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, a cruel hint of amusement. Then, without even pretending to engage the data in front of him, he chuckled. A low, dismissive sound. And then came the line, so sharp, so cutting, it might as well have drawn blood. If their parents had real jobs, not one of them would lose coverage. The silence cracked. A Democratic aide dropped her pen. A Republican congressman turned red, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Someone near the back whispered, "He said that out loud?" And still Vance sat there, arms crossed, completely unmoved, as if stating fact, not opinion. The words had been cold, but the implication was volcanic. He wasn't just doubting a system, he was condemning a class, entire communities, reduced to a punchline. Gasps turned to murmurs. The murmurs grew, scattered like sparks across the dry timber. One congresswoman shot up from her seat, her voice caught in her throat. Another covered his microphone and cursed under his breath. The chamber, once formal and stiff, now vibrated with visible tension. This wasn't disagreement. It was contempt, laid bare in a single sentence. A line had been crossed, not politically, but morally. You could feel it in the way every head turned toward Crockett, waiting for her response. But she didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her gaze was locked on Vance like a laser on glass. Her voice came low, but every word drilled straight through the marble walls. So children have to earn the right to be healthy now. The line didn't shout. It seared. One sentence, loaded with all the history, injustice, and human cost behind that budget cut. The tension in the room wasn't about healthcare anymore. That moment stripped away every number, every talking point. It wasn't policy versus policy. It was power versus people. And J.D. Vance had just told the country which side he was on. The chamber had stopped being a room full of lawmakers. It had become a courtroom. And every eye, every camera, every heartbeat knew who was standing trial. The air had already turned sharp, heavy with everything unspoken. Class, race, gender, power, all fighting for breath in a room that was supposed to be about numbers. But J.D. Vance didn't want to debate policy anymore. He wanted dominance. And when Crockett stood her ground, he chose a weapon older than any budget cut: public humiliation. He didn't wait for her to finish. He didn't even try to mask it with civility. He leaned in and interrupted her mid-sentence with a voice that cracked across the chamber like a whip. Ms. Crockett doesn't represent the working class. She represents TikTok, wigs, and fantasy politics. The silence didn't break, it ruptured. Audible gasps echoed across the room. A Republican intern's pen snapped in their hand. A Democratic lawmaker muttered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath. It wasn't just an insult. It was a precise, cutting attack, layered with racial coding, gender mockery, and classist scorn. Crockett stood frozen, not in fear, but in calculated restraint. She knew exactly what he was doing, and so did everyone watching. All at once, several Democrats rose from their seats, calling for order. "Point of order! Completely unacceptable!" The chamber stirred with outrage. But Vance wasn't done. He knew the cameras were still rolling. He wanted his moment to land like a kill shot. He raised his hand, not to surrender, but to silence, and added with ice in his voice, "She's not testifying, she's performing." It hit like a second slap, not just a dismissal, but a public erasure. Not a person, not a professional, just a performance, staged and disposable. The implication rang louder than the words. Crockett didn't belong here. Her voice was theatrics. Her presence was entertainment. The room was no longer a hearing. It was a battlefield. And for the first time that day, it wasn't about Medicaid or math. It was about how far a man in power would go to belittle a woman of color when she refused to back down. The second climax didn't come with shouting. It came with the kind of stillness that feels like an earthquake is about to hit. Vance hadn't just crossed the line. He'd obliterated it, and the whole nation had just watched him do it. But just when it seemed J.D. Vance had exhausted every sharp edge in his arsenal, he went even further. Not to argue, not to persuade, but to humiliate. What came next wasn't about policy, politics, or budgets. It was about power, and Vance knew exactly how to use it. He stood up, slow, controlled, like a man stepping into a spotlight he believed he owned. The room, already tense, fell even quieter. He didn't speak right away. He looked at Jasmine Crockett the way one might look at a threat too confident for his liking, and then pointed straight at her, finger stiff, unflinching. His voice rang out across the chamber, deliberate and brutal. "You're not Rosa Parks. You're just the Instagram version of a dream that died." The sentence hit like a detonation, not loud, but total. It didn't just suck the air out of the room. It froze it in place. No one moved. No one breathed. People didn't gasp. They went still, like something sacred had just been violated. A senior staffer in the corner stopped typing mid-keystroke. One congresswoman's jaw visibly dropped, but no words followed. The silence wasn't just shock. It was mourning. Mourning the audacity it took to say that. Mourning the weight it carried. Mourning what it meant for the dignity of the space they were in. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't shift. Her stare stayed locked on Vance, not in anger, but in something heavier. A stare that said, "I've heard worse, but not in this room, not at this level, not with this much permission." The camera closed in on her face. No expression, no movement, just presence. The kind of stillness that screams louder than any shout. And yet everyone heard what hadn't been said. That line wasn't just about her. It was aimed at every black woman who'd ever dared to lead, every activist who had marched, every voice that had once been silenced with dogs and hoses, now being mocked with digital metaphors and empty bravado. J.D. Vance didn't just insult a congresswoman, he tried to erase a lineage. He tried to turn the legacy of resistance into a meme. And he did it on government time, under oath, wearing a suit stitched with federal authority. That moment, those 12 words, didn't just cross a line. They crushed it underfoot, and the whole country had just witnessed it live. The moment J.D. Vance delivered his final insult, something shifted. Not just in the room, but in the country. It was no longer about a disagreement on policy. It wasn't about a clash between ideologies. This had become something far more personal, far more dangerous. Jasmine Crockett knew it. The second she locked eyes with him across that chamber, she wasn't looking at a political opponent. She was staring at a man who thought his power gave him permission to dehumanize her on live television, and she wasn't going to let that slide. She left the Capitol in silence. No press statement, no rebuttal, no shouting match. The cameras followed her all the way down the marble steps, but she didn't stop. What the world didn't know was that she wasn't heading to a rally or a network interview. She was headed straight to her legal team. While millions of viewers replayed the hearing, dissecting every frame of Vance's finger-pointing and his smug, weaponized contempt, Crockett was already in motion. For 48 hours, she didn't tweet. She didn't speak to journalists. She gathered evidence, assembled experts, and prepared to fight the only way power respects: through the law. Exactly 2 days later, the headline exploded across every major outlet in the country. Jasmine Crockett files federal lawsuit against Vice President J.D. Vance. The political world stopped, phones buzzed, newsrooms scrambled, and then came the number that stunned even the most cynical: $100 million in damages. Not just a lawsuit, a statement of war. The suit alleged public defamation, targeted racial and gender discrimination, and emotional distress, all carried out in full view of the American people. It didn't just quote Vance's words. It placed them in bold, underlined, time-stamped, and contextualized. A congressional hearing wasn't a stage for humiliation, and Crockett made it clear: power without restraint would have consequences. The details of the complaint were airtight. Page 1 set the tone with precision. The defendant, Vice President James David Vance, acting outside his legislative capacity, directed public statements at Representative Jasmine Crockett that were defamatory, discriminatory in nature, and deliberately constructed to undermine her character and credibility. The filing broke the damages into two categories. First, $25 million in compensatory damages for reputational harm, emotional toll, and real-time threats she and her staff received after the broadcast. But it was the second figure that rattled every legal analyst on television. $75 million in punitive damages, meant to signal that abuse of office, especially when drenched in bias, would not go unchecked. This wasn't a request for money, it was a demand for accountability. Crockett's legal team anticipated the defense, that Vance, as vice president, was immune from prosecution for statements made during official proceedings, but they had their rebuttal ready, grounded in precedent, and delivered with confidence. The vice president does not have immunity when acting outside his legislative duties. This was not lawmaking. This was character assassination. They cited multiple rulings that define the limits of official immunity, especially when elected officials veer into personal attacks unprotected by procedural relevance. And most importantly, they argued that this wasn't just a verbal misstep. It was part of a pattern, a calculated act of humiliation, carefully timed and executed in front of a national audience. And the law, they said, must respond. In a matter of hours, the lawsuit became the single most talked about legal development in Washington. Constitutional scholars appeared on air to unpack the implications. Civil rights organizations issued public statements of support. Millions of Americans, especially women of color, flooded social media with messages like, "Finally, accountability looks like this, and she didn't let it slide. What Jasmine Crockett had done was more than legal. It was cultural. She had turned the insult into an indictment. She had converted humiliation into evidence. And she'd made one thing clear to every person watching. The courtroom would be her answer. Not the microphone, not the headline, the law. And just like that, the fight left Capitol Hill and entered federal court, where power doesn't get to hide behind smirks, and every word is placed under oath. The courtroom battle had only just begun, but J.D. Vance was already losing ground. Not in legal arguments, but in the court of public perception. And as pressure mounted, he did what men in power have done for generations. He staged control. But this time, the performance wasn't behind closed doors. It was front and center, under blinding lights, in front of a sea of cameras. A day after Jasmine Crockett filed her $100 million lawsuit, Vance stood at a press podium, flanked by the polished set of official flags, his team positioned just behind him like armor. He cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and delivered his line like it had been tested in a dozen mirrors beforehand. Politics is not a place for hurt feelings. The words came out crisp, rehearsed, calculated, the image of composure. He wanted the nation to see him as the reasonable adult, a man immune to drama, unfazed by accusations. His expression stayed cold. His voice stayed even. It was all so perfectly sculpted. But it took less than an hour for it to crack. 6 separate video angles from the congressional hearing began circulating online. Not just news coverage, raw footage, behind-the-scenes clips, unfiltered and untouched. And what they showed wasn't composure. It was chaos. Vance yelling, face burning red, voice elevated, stabbing his finger toward Crockett like he was prosecuting her instead of debating policy. One video showed his lips curled in disdain. Another showed his hand slamming the desk as he interrupted her. Veins raised, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. From every perspective, the illusion of measured statesman collapsed. Side-by-side clips flooded social media. One frame of Vance calmly declaring, "Politics is not a place for hurt feelings," and the next showing him shouting so hard his mic distorted. The hypocrisy didn't just sting, it roared. Users tore into him with captions like, "This is what performance looks like. Composure doesn't start when the cameras stop rolling. If this isn't acting, what is?" The irony was deafening. The man who'd accused Jasmine Crockett of theatrics had been caught in his own emotional spiral, and every second was now public record. This moment wasn't just a PR misfire. It was the third explosion in a story already crackling with outrage. And this one hit Vance where it hurt most, in the image he had so carefully crafted. His calm, rational facade had been shattered by his own face, his own voice, his own rage caught on tape. No amount of polish could erase what the country now saw with its own eyes. The damage wasn't in what he said at the press conference, it was in the contrast between the man who played victim to emotional politics and the man who'd weaponized his own emotions like a club in front of the nation. The question spread like wildfire through media, through Twitter threads, through living rooms. Who's really performing now? J.D. Vance thought he had silenced the story. Instead, he poured gasoline on it, and the flames were only getting higher. The footage had shattered the illusion. The lawsuit had shifted the ground beneath Washington. But what came next revealed something far more dangerous than Vance's words. The silence of those who knew better, and still chose to say nothing. As J.D. Vance's face dominated every news cycle, reporters descended on the Capitol, eager for reaction from his Republican colleagues. One by one, they were met with shrugs, nervous chuckles, or the well-practiced dodge. I haven't seen the full context. Some senators outright refused to stop. One brushed past a cluster of microphones and muttered, "Not my issue." Another, visibly uncomfortable, adjusted his tie and whispered to an aide, "Keep walking." The corridors of Congress echoed with deliberate silence. Not from ignorance, but calculation. Vance was their vice president, and no one wanted to be the first to say he'd gone too far. But the dam didn't hold for long. On the House side, the response came swift and sharp. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and Ilhan Omar, issued a joint letter addressed directly to the House Committee on Ethics. 3 signatures, bold and unflinching, marked the beginning of a formal demand for accountability. The document cited Vance's behavior as a deliberate and sustained personal attack, steeped in race and gender bias, unbecoming of any elected official, let alone the Vice President of the United States. And its final line was impossible to ignore. No one, not even the Vice President, has the right to trample on human dignity. That sentence took on a life of its own. It was quoted in primetime monologues, printed in newspaper headlines, and posted in white letters across black backgrounds on every major social media platform. Protesters outside the Capitol carried signs with it in bold caps. Morning anchors read it aloud with solemn weight. The phrase didn't just challenge Vance's actions, it dared the system to prove it still had a soul. Inside Congress, pressure rose like steam behind a sealed door. Private meetings turned hostile. Democratic aides demanded answers. Some Republican staffers admitted off the record that they were deeply uncomfortable. But publicly, their offices stayed quiet. The party line was simple: hold the wall, don't break ranks. But even in the silence, something was shifting. Trust was cracking. Lines were being drawn, not between left and right, but between those willing to defend basic decency and those too afraid to try. And then came the question, not from a headline, not from a tweet, but from the mouths of lawmakers themselves, whispered behind closed doors, murmured in marble hallways, hanging in the air like smoke. Will anyone actually hold him accountable? That was the second true breaking point. Not the lawsuit, not the footage, but the moment when a nation realized that the real test wasn't J.D. Vance, it was everyone else. The question wasn't whether his actions were wrong. The world had already answered that. The question now was whether anyone in power had the courage to say, enough. And every second of silence after that felt like a verdict waiting to be written. The question echoed through every hallway of Congress, but no answer ever came. So the country turned its eyes to the only place left that still promised one: the courtroom. It was a gray morning in Washington, the kind that felt heavy before anything even started. Outside the federal courthouse, a line of reporters stretched down the block, shoulder to shoulder, microphones in hand, waiting for history to walk through the door. Inside, the chamber was silent, except for the hum of broadcast equipment. This wasn't just a trial. It was national television. The entire country was watching. J.D. Vance entered first. Gray suit, gray tie, face like stone. He walked slowly, flanked by 3 of the most expensive lawyers in D.C., each one wearing the same tight-lipped expression, like they knew they were walking into fire. Vance didn't look at the crowd, didn't glance at the cameras, but his posture spoke for him: stiff, defensive, bracing for impact. No smirk today, no swagger, just the weight of being the most powerful man in the room, and knowing that might not be enough this time. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in. She wore a navy blazer, her wire-rimmed glasses reflecting the courtroom lights, and in her right hand was the now famous red folder, the one she had carried into that hearing weeks ago, now swollen with 200 pages of annotated transcripts, internal memos, and evidence. She didn't pause for the cameras. She didn't wave. She just walked straight ahead and took her seat, calm, focused, unreadable. It wasn't about spectacle. It never had been. This was about truth, and now the law would decide who had twisted it. When the judge entered, the room rose. No one moved, no one whispered. Even the cameras held still. A moment later, the gavel struck once, sharp and deliberate. Then the judge leaned forward, peered over his glasses, and said what everyone had been thinking for weeks but no one had dared say in a courtroom until now. This trial is not about ideology. It is about the moral limits of power. The words landed like a challenge, not just to Vance, but to the system that had protected men like him for too long. And as silence fell again, the country leaned closer, breath held, waiting for what would come next. This wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a reckoning, live, raw, and ready to ignite. The courtroom had been tense before, but this was different. This wasn't strategy. This was exposure. Jasmine Crockett had waited for the exact moment when the silence was thickest, when the eyes of the room had adjusted to the rhythm of testimony and legal chess. That was when her lead attorney stood, voice calm but firm as steel, and dropped the request that made every head turn. Your Honor, we ask the court to admit and play an audio file, a recording taken from a concealed microphone embedded in Ms. Crockett's earpiece during the hearing in question. It took the judge a second to respond, not because he didn't hear it, but because he knew exactly what it meant. This wasn't just another piece of evidence. This was live ammunition. He gave a single nod. Proceed. The words barely left his mouth before the courtroom darkened slightly and the technician loaded the file. Then, silence, static, a breath, the hum of a hallway mic, and then a voice, smooth, confident, unmistakable. All we need is for her to snap, then we win. People like her are easy to bait. It's all emotion, no control. The words didn't explode. They sank, slow and suffocating, like oil filling the room. You could feel the shift, physical, immediate. No one moved. J.D. Vance didn't blink, but his knuckles whitened on the defense table, and his attorneys sat motionless, suddenly without anything to object to. There was no context to spin, no nuance to hide behind. It was him, his voice, his intent. Jasmine sat completely still, eyes focused ahead, hands folded. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The tape had done what no speech ever could. It tore the mask off. This wasn't an outburst. This wasn't an emotional reaction. This was orchestration. From the start, it had been a setup, a game of psychological warfare waged in plain sight, aimed at making a black woman unravel under pressure, but she didn't. Near the jury box, juror 6, a black woman in her mid-40s, professional, composed, pressed her lips together tightly and narrowed her eyes. She didn't look at Vance. She looked down at her notepad, then up again, biting her lower lip as if to keep something powerful from spilling out. She didn't speak. No one did. But her silence echoed louder than any verdict, because what they had just heard wasn't a misstep. It was a mindset, a calculated attempt to use identity as a weapon. Vance's words didn't just expose strategy. They revealed something more chilling, his belief that provoking pain was a path to victory. And now it was on the record. The real twist wasn't that Jasmine Crockett stayed calm. It was that J.D. Vance had built his entire plan on the assumption that she wouldn't. And now the courtroom and the country saw exactly who had control all along. The man who claimed to be the voice of reason was revealed to be the architect of chaos. And in the silence that followed, it was no longer a question of who was emotional. It was a question of who had just been caught playing God and losing. The audio recording had already cracked the mask, but now Vance's defense team scrambled to glue it back together before it shattered completely. Their lead attorney stood, straightened his cuff, and approached the bench with the kind of calm that only comes from rehearsed damage control. His voice was even, but thin, like someone trying to hold a door shut while the house burns down behind him. That statement was part of internal political strategy, not intended for public interpretation. He said it like it was nothing, just politics, just business. But in that courtroom, after what everyone had just heard, it landed like an insult. The jury didn't blink, the judge didn't shift, and Jasmine Crockett didn't wait. Her attorney didn't say a word. She simply walked to the evidence table, pulled out a thick folder with a red clip, and turned to a marked tab. With a single motion, she slid a printed email into the overhead projector. The screen lit up behind her. Big, bold, undeniable. Subject line, Debate Prep, Crockett. Dated 2 days before the hearing, from a senior advisor inside the office of the vice president, and then in highlighted yellow, the line that pierced through every excuse like a blade. Agitate at the right moment. Make her scream. The more she loses control, the more we gain. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A few jurors shifted in their seats. One crossed his arms, eyes narrowed. Another leaned forward, brow furrowed, trying to take in the words twice to be sure she read them right. Vance's face stiffened, but he didn't speak. His attorneys glanced at each other, but no one moved to object. Because they couldn't. It wasn't theory anymore. It was proof. This wasn't some unfortunate turn of phrase. It wasn't heat-of-the-moment improvisation. It was tactical, pre-written, sent, shared, executed. Vance's team didn't just anticipate Crockett's reaction. They designed for it. They built a strategy around the idea of breaking her, not on policy, not on logic, but on pressure, on poking until the woman they feared most stopped sounding like a leader and started looking like a headline. But it didn't work. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She stayed calm, measured, surgical. And that calm had now become the courtroom's greatest weapon, because now it was clear. The smear campaign wasn't an accident. It was an agenda. And the very thing they hoped would humiliate her had now exposed them completely. The courtroom had already seen damning evidence, heard strategy turned weapon, and watched a man in power begin to unravel. But this was the moment Jasmine Crockett had been building toward from the very beginning. Not just to expose what J.D. Vance had done, but to force him to face it, in his own words, under oath, with nowhere to hide. She stood slowly, every movement deliberate, and approached the witness stand like a surgeon preparing for the final incision. No theatrics, no raised voice, just silence sharp enough to cut. Then into the microphone, calm and clear. "Mr. Vance, did you ever say, this is a chance to smear people like her?" The question dropped like a blade. Not a scream, not a threat, just truth, dressed in precision. J.D. Vance flinched. For the first time in the trial, he didn't look in control. His posture stiffened. His hands fidgeted slightly on the armrest. You could feel the tension ripple across the room like static. He glanced toward his attorney, as if silently begging for an objection that wouldn't come. Then he swallowed hard and leaned toward the mic, voice quiet, unsure. "I don't recall saying that. Not exactly." The jury didn't speak, but they didn't need to. One juror cocked an eyebrow. Another scribbled something in her notepad without breaking eye contact with Vance. The room didn't breathe. It waited. Jasmine didn't move for a second. She just stared. Not angry, not surprised. Just steady. Like a woman who'd known all along that this moment would come. Then she took 2 small steps toward the evidence table, rested her hand on its edge, and delivered the sentence that no cross-examination could erase. "The problem isn't that you forgot. It's that you've done it too many times to remember." A soundless wave swept through the room. It wasn't applause. It wasn't outrage. It was recognition. J.D. Vance wasn't just on trial for what he said. He was on trial for a pattern, a history, a learned behavior polished by privilege, reinforced by power, and exposed in the one room where truth doesn't blink. And in that moment, stripped of spin, stripped of defense, the man who once called her a performance artist had become the center of the most damning performance of all, a legacy unraveling under the weight of its own repetition. The moment had been building like a storm, day after day, word by word, blow by blow. And now, with the world watching and the courtroom on edge, the final judgment was ready to fall. 4 days of deliberation. That's how long the jury had disappeared behind closed doors, combing through every transcript, every email, every cruel syllable caught on tape. The country waited, restless and divided. Protesters outside the courthouse clutched handmade signs in the rain. Pundits filled every cable slot with speculation. But inside that courtroom, as the 12 jurors filed back in, the air felt frozen in place. Not a cough, not a breath, just gravity. J.D. Vance sat stone still in his chair, suit perfect, tie knotted too tight. His eyes stayed low, jaw clenched, every muscle in his face locked in denial. Jasmine Crockett, across the aisle, kept her gaze forward. Her red folder lay flat before her, untouched. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She just waited. Not for revenge, but for truth to finally speak. The judge asked the foreperson to rise. A man in his 50s stood up, holding a single sheet of paper in both hands like it weighed 50 pounds. His voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Vice President James David Vance, liable for systemic defamation." A pause followed. Not for drama, but for the meaning to land. And then, we award damages to the plaintiff in the amount of $100 million. It hit like thunder. A ripple ran through the gallery. One reporter gasped out loud. A woman in the back stifled a cry. J.D. Vance didn't move, but the flicker of panic across his face was unmistakable. His lead attorney closed his eyes for a beat, already calculating the fallout. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Not a single muscle on her face changed. Instead, she closed her eyes slowly, took in one long breath like it was the first she'd had in weeks, and whispered into the silence, "This is for my mother." The words weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. They pierced straight through the marble walls and into every heart tuned in across the country. For the people watching at home, the victory wasn't legal, it was spiritual. They saw themselves in that moment. Every girl told to be quiet, every woman dismissed, every person of color labeled too emotional to lead. They watched her stand in the storm, not with rage but with restraint. And they wept. Because Jasmine didn't just win a case, she reclaimed something bigger, the right to exist in a space that told her she didn't belong. And when the verdict came down, it didn't just mark the end of a trial. It marked the beginning of something none of them could take back. A line crossed, a mask removed, a reckoning made real. The courtroom had spoken, loudly, publicly, and unmistakably. But Jasmine Crockett knew that a verdict wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And the moment she stepped out of those courthouse doors, she didn't step out as a plaintiff or a politician. She stepped out as a woman who had just carved a crack into the walls of power and was ready to push it open wider for everyone behind her. The press conference was held just steps away from the courtroom. The sun was beginning to break through the morning clouds, casting a soft light over the crowd of reporters, supporters, and survivors. A dozen microphones lined the podium. Camera shutters clicked nonstop. Jasmine walked up alone. No entourage, no handlers. Just her and the truth that had carried her through fire. She wore navy, no jewelry except for a simple silver pin in the shape of a scale. Her red folder, now iconic, remained clutched in her hand. She stood before the crowd, took a breath, and then leaned in toward the microphone with the same calm power that had stunned the courtroom just hours earlier. "I didn't file this lawsuit because I was weak." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the crowd like a quiet storm. "I filed it to remind this country of something it should never have forgotten, that everyone is worthy of dignity, even here, even in politics." The crowd fell silent. You could hear someone in the back whisper, "Say it again." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her strength wasn't in volume. It was in the clarity of her conviction. A clarity that came not from anger, but from years of being underestimated and still standing. We keep telling women, especially Black women, that we have to be tougher, louder, smarter, nicer. But what we never say out loud is that none of it matters if the people in power still see us as props or threats. I filed this lawsuit because I've seen too many women silenced. Not with laws, but with laughter, with smirks, with smears. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some just stared, knowing they were watching something bigger than a headline unfold in real time. Jasmine continued, her eyes steady, her tone unwavering. "This wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who's been called dramatic instead of passionate, unqualified instead of brilliant, angry instead of brave. Every time we're told that we're performing when all we're doing is surviving in rooms that were never built for us." Behind her, on the courthouse steps, a small group of young women held signs that read, "She spoke for us, and respect is not radical." A few were crying, some were just watching in awe. Jasmine turned slightly toward them as she continued. "This verdict sends a message, not just to J.D. Vance, not just to the ones who stood by and stayed silent, but to the next generation. You don't need to shrink yourself to be heard. You don't need to choose between power and principle. You do not need permission to stand in your truth." And then her voice softened. Her eyes flickered for a moment, almost like she was speaking to someone no one else could see. "This is for my mother." A pause, she exhaled. "And for every mother, sister, daughter, and friend who never got the chance to speak back." There was no applause, not yet, just silence. And then, as if a dam broke, the crowd erupted. Not in cheers, but in something deeper, in gratitude, in recognition, in reverence. Jasmine waited for it to settle before lifting her folder, placing it carefully on the podium, and delivering her final announcement. With part of the damages awarded, I'm launching a new initiative. It's called Power Without Permission. Murmurs swept the crowd. She explained without reading from notes, because this had been planned long before the trial ended. It will fund legal support, campaign resources, and mentorship for Black women who are stepping into the political arena. And it will be built by women who know what it means to stand alone and still speak up. She stepped away from the microphone, letting the words linger, letting the mission breathe. Cameras flashed again, but Jasmine didn't pose. She didn't smile. She just stood there, like a pillar carved from fire and silence, unshakable in the face of history. Behind her, a reporter leaned into her mic and whispered to her cameraman. She didn't just win. She changed the rules. And she did. Not by screaming, not by breaking, but by refusing to play a game that was rigged against her from the start. And as Jasmine Crockett walked back down those courthouse steps, the country didn't just see a plaintiff or a politician. They saw a blueprint of what it looks like when dignity becomes louder than power and when a woman refuses to wait her turn to lead. The creation of Power Without Permission sent shockwaves through the political landscape, not just because Jasmine Crockett was building something new, but because the system that tried to silence her was finally starting to fracture. And when institutions move, it's not because they want to, it's because they no longer have a choice. The consequences came swiftly, and they didn't come from protesters or social media outrage. They came from inside the very halls of government that once shielded J.D. Vance. Within 1 week of the verdict, the Senate Ethics Committee announced a formal review of Vance's conduct. And within 48 hours of that came the real blow. Effective immediately, Vice President J.D. Vance is suspended from all leadership duties related to the Federal Communications Oversight Committee. It was more than a title. The committee controlled regulatory input on speech, broadcast ethics, and public media access. And for years, Vance had used that position to shape national messaging, funding, and policy direction. Now stripped of authority, his power was no longer institutional. It was purely symbolic. He still held the title of vice president, but in every meeting that followed, every closed-door negotiation, every press appearance, there was a new understanding in the room. He no longer spoke with the full weight of the government behind him. The official statement from the committee chair was terse and final. We believe that public trust in this position has been compromised. Until a broader review is completed, Mr. Vance will not participate in oversight or regulatory matters pertaining to communication ethics. He didn't show up for the next hearing. Cameras waited outside. They never caught him. Sources said he was advised to lay low, but the silence screamed louder than any apology he never gave. Meanwhile, the ripple effects extended far beyond Washington. At Columbia University, where law, politics, and ethics intersect in some of the most rigorous classrooms in the country, the faculty of the School of Government and Public Affairs made a unanimous decision. The Crockett versus Vance case would be added as a core module in their law, power, and accountability curriculum. The course title was Stark, Cutting, and Impossible to Ignore: When Power Collides with Dignity. Professor Mariah Bennett, a constitutional law scholar who had taught at Columbia for over 20 years, explained the decision in a televised panel. We've taught Watergate, we've taught Anita Hill, but this was different. This case wasn't about legality versus illegality. It was about whether personal dignity can survive public power. And that's a question our future leaders must be forced to confront head-on. In the classroom, students were already unpacking the trial in real time. They analyzed the courtroom strategies, yes, but more importantly, they studied the rhetoric, the tactics, the systemic manipulation behind every phrase Vance had used. TikTok, wigs, fantasy politics. She's not testifying, she's performing. Agitate at the right moment. Make her scream. And in the center of that analysis sat one unshakable truth. None of it was accidental. None of it was just politics. These weren't slips, they were blueprints, and the class was being trained to see them before they happen again. Guest speakers included media analysts, civil rights attorneys, and even a retired judge who admitted, live, that he had never seen a case where image warfare and identity politics collided so violently in open court and were dismantled so precisely. Students debated the limits of free speech, the blurry edge between political theater and targeted harm, and what it means when government positions are used not for governance, but for personal destruction. One student stood up during the final discussion of the semester and said, "This wasn't just a courtroom victory, it was a cultural audit." And she was right. Because as the trial began to fade from front-page headlines and the noise of the next scandal moved in, something had shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, but foundational. For the first time in a long time, a government official had tried to weaponize his platform against someone he thought couldn't push back, and lost. And that loss didn't just cost him a case, it cost him credibility, control, and most importantly, the assumption that he could say anything, do anything, and still walk into the next committee hearing like nothing happened. Now every step J.D. Vance took in Washington felt a little heavier. Every door opened a little slower, and every conversation began with an unspoken truth hanging in the air. You are not untouchable anymore. And for every young woman sitting in a classroom or standing on the edge of a campaign trail, that truth was a door cracking open. One no longer locked by fear or silence or permission. One kicked open by someone who chose to fight with facts instead of fury and walked out of court not just vindicated, but victorious. But long after the verdict was delivered and the headlines moved on, the question still echoed. What was all of this really about? Because this was never just about one woman and one man. It wasn't just about a slur on national television or a courtroom war that shook Washington. It was about something older, deeper, something woven into the American fabric and too often ignored until someone bleeds from it. And Jasmine Crockett, standing in her fire and refusing to burn, had turned the nation's gaze toward that truth. That dignity is not a request, it's a right. The lesson here didn't arrive in a grand finale or a press statement. It arrived in the quiet. In the silence that came when J.D. Vance could no longer speak over her. In the stillness when millions watched and waited, and she didn't flinch. Because what Jasmine taught the world wasn't how to win a case. It was how to win without losing yourself. Her story became more than a courtroom drama. It became a mirror. And what America saw staring back was a system built to reward cruelty and punish those who dared to respond with grace. This story reminds us that power without compassion is not strength. It's rot in a polished suit. And when left unchecked, it seeps into every corner of public life, into law, into policy, into the very language we use when we talk about women, about blackness, about what leadership is supposed to look like. J.D. Vance didn't fall because of one outburst. He fell because Jasmine exposed the scaffolding that had always held him up. A network of expectations, privileges, and protections that crumble the moment a woman like her refuses to shrink. One of the most dangerous lies ever told in politics is that strength looks like shouting. That authority is measured in how much space a man can take up, and that dignity is weakness. But Jasmine Crockett flipped that myth inside out, and she did it without ever raising her voice. And here's where the real shift happened. Millions of people didn't just cheer her on, they saw themselves in her, the woman who had to keep her hands folded when screamed at, the woman who had to smile while being insulted, the woman who had to be twice as prepared, twice as composed, and still be called unqualified. Jasmine didn't fight just for herself. She became a vessel for everyone who never had the microphone or the courtroom to fight back. But the bigger message, it's this. You can challenge power without becoming what it tried to make you. So many women are taught to survive systems by adapting to them, to get louder, meaner, more ruthless. Jasmine Crockett chose another path. She stayed grounded, rooted not in revenge, but in principle. She weaponized facts, not fury. And in doing so, she exposed not just the cruelty of one man, but the fragility of every system that allowed him to rise unchecked. There's a powerful clarity in what she did and in what followed. From federal courtrooms to university lecture halls, from campaign offices to living rooms, people began asking questions they had long been afraid to confront. What happens when power is used not to lead, but to humiliate? What does it say about our democracy when the most targeted people must also be the most composed just to be believed? And most of all, when someone like J.D. Vance is finally held accountable, why does it still feel like the exception, not the rule? Jasmine's victory wasn't just symbolic, it was structural, because every institution that backed Vance, political, legal, cultural, had to face a reckoning, and not because a mob forced them to, but because one woman stood alone and said, "Enough." It's easy to dismiss moments like this as anomalies, to chalk them up to charisma, luck, or timing, but the truth is, none of this was accidental. Jasmine Crockett was methodical, deliberate, unshakable. She didn't just survive an attack. She revealed the anatomy of one, step by step, word by word, until there was nothing left to deny. And that, perhaps, is the most lasting legacy of her story. Not the verdict, not the fund she launched, but the blueprint she left behind. A blueprint for how to speak truth in rooms built to silence you. A blueprint for how to remain human when the world calls you a performance. A blueprint for how to win and then make space for others to win too. Power without permission wasn't just a name, it was a declaration, a reminder that no one, not even a vice president, gets to decide who belongs in politics, or who deserves respect, or who gets to walk into a hearing without being reduced to hashtags and hairpieces. Jasmine reclaimed what had always been hers, voice, place, purpose, and she handed it forward. Because here's the truth, you don't need to scream to make history. Sometimes all it takes is standing your ground long enough for the world to stop looking away. And so this story, at its core, is not about vengeance, it's about restoration. Restoring faith in accountability. Restoring the idea that politics can still serve people. Restoring the belief that decency is not a liability, but a leadership trait. So if you take one thing from Jasmine Crockett's story, let it be this. You are not too small to confront power, and power is never too big to fall. And when you speak, not for applause, not for clout, but for truth, someone somewhere will stop pretending they don't see you. They'll hear you. They'll remember you. Because courage like this is contagious. And dignity, when demanded and not requested, becomes its own revolution. And that is how one woman in a navy blazer, armed with a red folder and a steady voice, did what centuries of systems thought they had perfected how to avoid. She made them answer, not just to her, but to all of us. And if stories like Jasmine's can shift institutions and rattle power, then the final question becomes, what do we do with it? Because this isn't just entertainment, it's instruction. It's not a movie you watch and forget. It's a mirror held up to your own silence, your own hesitation, your own next move. The courtroom may be closed, the cameras may be off, but what comes next doesn't belong to her alone. It belongs to you. It belongs to all of us. Let's be honest. We're living in a world where dignity is too often treated like a luxury, where people are told to be silent, smile, survive, but never disrupt, never demand, never confront. And when someone finally does, it feels radical, explosive, newsworthy, but it shouldn't be. Standing up for what's right shouldn't feel rare. It should feel routine. And that starts with us. Not just watching these stories unfold, but living them out in our own communities, schools, workplaces, and families. Every one of us has a voice, a platform, a moment where we either speak up or stay quiet. And those moments, they're happening every single day. At work, when someone makes a comment that crosses the line. In classrooms, when certain students are overlooked again and again. At the dinner table, when the conversation turns casual, but cruel. Or online, when the loudest voices are often the ones doing the most harm. You don't need a microphone or a judge's gavel to hold someone accountable. Sometimes all it takes is saying, "That's not okay." Sometimes it's refusing to laugh. Sometimes it's choosing to listen, especially when the person speaking doesn't look like you or come from where you come from. This story teaches us that the line between complicity and courage is razor thin, and most of us walk it every day. The difference is whether you stay comfortable or decide to get involved. And no, you won't always have the perfect words. You won't always feel brave. But neither did Jasmine when she first walked into that hearing room. She didn't come in as a hero. She became one because she chose not to back down, even when it would have been easier, especially when it would have been safer. So how do we carry that forward? Start small, but start now. Speak up in rooms where people like Jasmine are still being dismissed, interrupted, or mocked. Fund and follow the voices that are doing the work even when no one's watching. Support organizations like Power Without Permission that are building power from the ground up, not waiting for permission from systems that were never built for them. But most importantly, examine your own silence. Ask yourself, in the last week, how many times did I choose comfort over confrontation? How many times did I see harm and walk away because it wasn't my place? And how many people were watching me, wondering if they should stay quiet too? Because silence spreads, but so does courage. Every person who saw Jasmine stand her ground just got a new reference point. Every young girl who watched her dismantle the performance of power got a new definition of leadership. And every bystander who stayed silent before now knows what it looks like to step in, even when the stakes are high, even when you're alone. And make no mistake, this work is not easy. It's uncomfortable. It will cost you something. You may lose status, convenience, or approval. But if your dignity doesn't cost anything, it's probably not worth much. The systems that fail people like Jasmine don't crumble in a day. They're chipped away by every moment someone refuses to look away. Every moment someone says, "That's not justice." Every moment someone doesn't laugh along. That's how you shift culture. That's how you move the needle. You don't need to be a congresswoman to call out hypocrisy. You don't need to be a lawyer to demand accountability. You just need to show up. And when you do it loudly, do it early, and do it when it matters. Because if you wait until it's safe, it's already too late. The world changes when regular people decide they've seen enough, when they take their pain, their stories, their silence, and turn them into tools, into fire, into light. So the next time someone tells you it's just politics, remind them, politics is people. And when people are hurt, dismissed, or dehumanized, that is your business. That is your moment. That is your court. Stand up in it. Speak truth in it. Don't wait for a title. Don't wait for the perfect words. Just begin. Because the real lesson Jasmine Crockett gave us is not that one woman can take on a vice president, but that every person has a line they will no longer let others cross. Find yours, defend it, and then help someone else defend theirs too. And if you're asking, what now? Here's your answer. Check your local elections. Support candidates who see people, not just policies. Fund grassroots movements led by women of color. They're not the future, they're the present. Start conversations in the places that feel too quiet. Discomfort is where change lives. Call out injustice, especially when it's subtle, especially when it's dressed up in a suit and tie. Be the person who shows up, not just for applause, but for action. Because this isn't about being Jasmine. It's about becoming someone who refuses to look away when the next Jasmine walks into the fire. And when that moment comes, and it will come, may you be the kind of person who doesn't ask for permission to do what's right. You just do it, and the world catches up. Because stories like Jasmine's are not just about trials and verdicts, they're about thresholds. The quiet ones we cross in our own lives when we choose to either stand still or step into discomfort. Her lawsuit may have ended with a number, a headline, a courtroom cheer, but the deeper victory was internal, a spiritual shift for those who watched her. It reminded us that power unchecked will always test its limits, and dignity unprotected will always be the first thing sacrificed. In a world that rewards aggression and punishes restraint, Jasmine made self-control revolutionary. She showed that justice isn't just about being right. It's about staying human in rooms designed to erase you. And that kind of courage, The kind that doesn't scream but holds steady, teaches more than any closing argument. It teaches the world how to recognize real strength. Not the loud kind, but the kind that doesn't break when it's being pushed to. And when that kind of strength wins, it makes space for everyone else who's been told to sit down and take it quietly. Now the responsibility shifts, not to politicians or pundits, but to us. Because watching change happen is not the same as being part of it. You don't need a courtroom or a national scandal to take a stand. You just need a moment, in a workplace, a classroom, a family dinner, where something small but wrong is said and you don't let it slide. That's where it starts. Not with the big battles, but the tiny ones that add up to culture. That add up to either silence or resistance. Because every time you say, "That's not okay," even if your voice shakes, you shift the ground just a little. You break the pattern just enough. And yes, it's uncomfortable. You'll be called difficult, dramatic, overreacting. But that's how systems protect themselves, by making resistance feel like betrayal instead of integrity. And that's why what Jasmine did matters so much. She redefined the fight. She made it clear that pushing back with clarity, dignity, and law is not rage. It's self-respect. And it's time we made that our baseline, not our exception. So what now? You carry the story. Not as a symbol, not as a moment to repost, but as a mirror. You ask yourself where you've let things slide, where you've been complicit in comfort, where you've mistaken patience for peace. And then you change it. You say something. You step up. You teach your kids what dignity looks like by living it. You support the people doing the hard work, even when it's not perfect. You understand that speaking out might cost you, but silence always costs someone else more. Jasmine didn't win for praise. She won so no one would have to beg for basic respect on national television again. So let her story be a spark, not a souvenir. Let it live in how you move through the world. And when it's your turn, and it will come, don't hesitate. Don't apologize. Don't wait for permission. Take the mic, hold your ground, and remind them. Power has limits. And people, no matter how underestimated, always have the final word. And maybe that's the point, that stories like hers don't end when the cameras cut. They keep echoing in living rooms, classrooms, and quiet moments when someone decides to do the right thing instead of the easy one. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it begins as a whisper that refuses to die. Jasmine's victory was never about going viral. It was about proving that truth can still stand up straight in a crooked room. So if you remember anything, remember this. History doesn't move on its own. It moves when ordinary people stop waiting for someone else to move it. That's your role now, to carry that torch into the corners still dim with indifference, to make decency louder than denial. Because if she could turn one hearing into a turning point, then what might you do with your voice? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.